It was well past midnight at the Trump residence. The house had gone silent, the kind of silence that feels thick in the air, like time itself had taken a deep breath and decided to rest. Upstairs, everyone had already fallen asleep. The security detail rotated quietly. The housekeepers had finished their shifts, and not a single sound stirred within the vast, ornate halls, except for a faint glimmer of light leaking out from under the door of Donald Trump's private study. Barron Trump, now 23, couldn't sleep. He had been pacing in the hallway, lost in thought. The shadows of the chandeliers above stretched across the polished floors, and every step he took echoed with that late-night eeriness only insomnia knows. As he passed by his father's study, he noticed something unusual. The heavy oak door, normally locked at this hour, was left slightly ajar. Curiosity crept in. He hesitated at first. He knew that room as his father's private sanctuary, the place where deals were struck, phone calls were made, and decisions were whispered. But tonight, there was no voice, no phone call, no movement, only silence, and the low golden light of a single floor lamp. Barron leaned closer, pushing the door just enough to peer through, and what he saw made him freeze. His father, Donald Trump, was sitting on the floor, not in one of his leather chairs, not behind the grand mahogany desk. He was on the rug, legs folded, head bowed slightly, eyes closed, dressed not in a suit or tie, but in a simple long-sleeve shirt and plain gray sweatpants. His hands were clasped tightly together, fingers interlocked, and his lips, they were moving. He was praying. Barron stood motionless. He had never seen his father like this, not vulnerable, not quiet, not human in this way. It shook something in him. For the first time, the larger-than-life image of his father cracked, and what lay beneath was something deeply real. Donald opened his eyes slowly, as if sensing something. He looked toward the doorway. "Come in, son." "It's okay," he said quietly, his voice unusually gentle, like it belonged to someone who had been thinking about things far too long. Barron stepped inside hesitantly, closing the door behind him with the softest click. "I didn't mean to intrude," Barron said, his voice low but steady, unsure of what to do with the image he had just walked in on. "You're not intruding," Donald replied, gesturing to the spot on the rug beside him. "Sometimes, God lets others witness you in your most honest moments. Maybe this is one of those nights." Barron sat down slowly, mirroring his father's posture, still unsure whether he had woken from a dream or stepped into something more sacred. "I've never seen you pray before," Barron admitted, his tone filled with quiet wonder. "I usually don't let anyone see it," Donald answered, offering a faint smile. "But it's something I've done for as long as I can remember, especially when life becomes complicated." Barron didn't reply immediately. He just watched his father. For the first time, he wasn't trying to understand the political titan, the media storm, or the business mogul. He was just trying to understand the man sitting quietly beside him, his father. The air in the study was still. The shadows on the walls, cast by the single lamp, danced gently like flickers of a forgotten past. Barron sat cross-legged beside his father, unsure what to expect next, but knowing instinctively that something important was unfolding. There was a gravity in the room, not political, not familial, but spiritual. "I've always wondered," Barron began slowly, breaking the silence, "when things got really hard for you, what did you turn to?" Donald didn't answer right away. He looked ahead as if the answer was somewhere far in the distance. "I turned to him," he said finally, his voice softer than Barron had ever heard it. "Not always perfectly, not always consistently, but when the noise got too loud and I couldn't see through it, I prayed." Barron blinked, unsure whether he was more surprised by the confession or by the way his father seemed to shrink into something more vulnerable, more approachable. "But you never seemed like someone who doubted," Barron said, his tone searching. "I doubt all the time," Donald replied with a quiet chuckle. "I just never showed it. When you carry a family name like ours, you learn to hide the cracks. People mistake power for certainty. But I've had more silent conversations with God than I've had with most of the people I trust." There was something deeply humbling about hearing that. "I always thought you relied on your instinct," Barron admitted, Like you made every decision based on gut and confidence. I did, Donald nodded, but my gut often led me straight into the wilderness. And when I was out there, completely lost, guess who I talked to? Barron didn't respond. I'd sit alone, Donald continued, sometimes on the floor, just like this. And I'd ask God to help me see, not to fix everything, not to hand me a solution, just to help me keep walking. That's all I ever asked for. Enough strength to keep moving. There was a long pause. Barron looked down at the rug, running his fingers over the edge of the fabric. Do you think he listens? Barron asked quietly, as if afraid of the answer. I know he does, Donald replied, turning to his son with eyes that seemed far older than his years. But not in the way people expect. He doesn't always speak with miracles. Sometimes he speaks by keeping you from collapsing. You don't fall apart, and that's your answer. Barron swallowed hard, feeling something heavy settle in his chest, not grief, not guilt, but recognition. For years, he had watched his father stand tall against an endless tide of pressure. Now he realized there was a silent partner in that strength. I never prayed before, Barron confessed, his voice low. Not really, I always thought. I didn't know how. There's no right way, Donald said gently. Just talk. That's all. Like you're talking to someone who knows every version of you and still listens. Barron looked at his father for a long time, studying the wear in his eyes, the deep lines at the corners that didn't come from smiling, but from carrying things silently. I want to try, Barron said finally, barely above a whisper. Donald nodded and closed his eyes once more. Then let's talk to him. Together, he answered, folding his hands again. And in that quiet, golden-lit room, two generations knelt side by side, not as president and son, not as symbols, but as men learning how to speak to something greater than themselves. The house was silent. Outside, the wind carried only the faint rustling of early autumn leaves brushing against the windows. Inside, the walls of the study bore witness to something that few, if any, had ever seen Donald Trump. Not speaking, not deciding, but simply listening. Barron sat beside him, eyes half closed, heart louder than his thoughts. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of questions neither had asked out loud, full of answers that didn't need words. I don't know what to say, Barron admitted quietly, his head bowed. What if I say the wrong thing? You can't, Donald replied, his voice low and steady. He already knows what's in your heart. The words are just for you. There was something freeing about that. So Barron closed his eyes and said the only thing he truly meant in that moment. Help me understand where I'm going, he whispered, because I don't know anymore. No thunder cracked, no divine light shone down, just the warmth of the carpet beneath them, the hum of the distant refrigerator, and the sense that something inside him had shifted. Donald turned his head slightly, watching his son. You said that like someone who's already halfway there, he said gently. Barron didn't respond. He didn't need to. For the first time, the questions that haunted him felt less like weights and more like lanterns guiding, not dragging. I used to think strength was pretending you weren't scared, Barron said after a long pause. Now I think maybe it's admitting you are, and still trying anyway. Donald gave a faint smile, the kind that only comes when pride and peace mix into just the right measure. That's exactly what it is, he replied, and that's why I come here. Not because I always believe I'll win, but because I need to remember it's okay not to know everything. The room was still again, but no longer heavy. Barron looked around at the books, the framed photos, the old clock that ticked just a bit too loud. Everything seemed quieter, even his own thoughts. When did you start doing this? Barron asked, curious now not just about the practice, but the man who had always seemed larger than life. Years ago, Donald answered, before you were born, when the cameras weren't around, when I was just a man with a name too big for his own shoulders. Barron nodded slowly. You ever get answers? Sometimes, Donald said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, but most of the time, I get peace, and that's enough to make it through the next day. And in that moment under the dim light, surrounded by shadows and silence, Barron Trump learned something he hadn't expected, that faith didn't begin with certainty, but with surrender. That strength wasn't in holding it all together, but in letting go of the need to. That night, they didn't talk politics. They didn't talk legacy. They just stayed there side by side, with their hands folded and their hearts open. That night, Barron Trump did not leave the room as the same young man who had entered. He hadn't walked away with divine revelations or life-altering clarity, but he had seen something rare, something that would echo in the quieter corners of his memory for years to come. For the first time, he witnessed his father, not as the towering figure the world debated endlessly, but as a man fragile, real, and quietly seeking the same thing Barron had long been chasing: peace. It was not a press conference, not a televised speech, not a carefully curated moment. It was a private surrender, wrapped in silence and lit only by faith. Barron would go on to face more decisions, more pressure, and more questions from the world around him. But after that night, the weight on his shoulders felt just a little lighter, not because the world had changed, but because something inside him had. He had learned that prayer wasn't weakness, that doubt didn't make him broken, and that strength could look like sitting on the floor with the only man who truly knew what it meant to carry a name too heavy for most hearts. Barron would never tell anyone what he prayed for that night, but it didn't matter, because the moment wasn't about answers. It was about learning that even in the silence, even in uncertainty, he was never truly alone. Let's keep the conversation going. Subscribe, share, and drop your thoughts below. Your perspective is valuable and might inspire others.